The docking clamp hit the hull like a punch. I was already on my feet before the sound finished echoing through the shuttle cabin, straightening my jacket, checking the notebook in my inside pocket, still there, always there. The shuttle door slid open and the smell of the Val Thierry station hit me first. Cold metal, something faintly chemical. And underneath it all, a scent like burnt cedar. Their atmosphere processors ran hotter than human standard. I had read about that. I had read about everything. I stepped out alone. No guards behind me, no diplomatic aides carrying polished cases, no hovering military escort, just me, one bag over my shoulder, and the kind of face that people forget the moment they stop looking at it. The reception chamber was enormous. The ceiling stretched up at least 30 m, lined with rows of bioluminescent panels that shifted colors slowly, cycling through deep violet and cold blue. The floor was some kind of dark stone, perfectly smooth, and my footsteps made almost no sound on it, which I suspected was intentional. Everything about this place was designed to make visitors feel small. I did not feel small, but I let my shoulders drop a little, let my eyes go slightly wide, let my mouth open just a fraction as I looked around. It cost me nothing to look impressed. There were perhaps 60 Val Thierry standing in two formal lines, leading toward a raised platform at the far end of the chamber. They were tall, most of them stood nearly 2 and 1 m, with the long proportions of a species that had evolved under lighter gravity. Their skin ranged from deep slate gray to a pale silver blue, and their eyes were large and amber, designed for low-light environments. They wore layered formal garments in deep colors, heavy with embroidered rank insignia that I had spent 3 months learning to read. Standing at the center of the raised platform was Princess Saravin Jackwell. She was younger than her official portrait suggested, maybe early 30s by human reckoning, though Val Thierry aging worked differently, and I would not have placed a confident bet. She stood with the kind of stillness that is learned, not natural, the stillness of someone who had been told since childhood that movement was weakness. Her robes were deep indigo, trimmed with something that caught the bioluminescent light and threw it back in cold sparks. Her amber eyes found me the moment I stepped into the chamber, and they did not move away. She looked at me the way you look at something you are trying to classify, and failing. I walked toward her at a comfortable, unhurried pace, not slow enough to seem hesitant, not fast enough to seem eager. I stopped at the base of the platform and inclined my head, not a bow in acknowledgement. Ambassador Callum Gray, she said. Her translator device rendered her voice in flat, clean English, stripping away whatever tonal quality the original had carried. Earth representative to the Val Thierry sovereignty. That's me, I said. A small ripple moved through the assembled court. I had been told that Val Thierry diplomatic protocol required a formal title and a statement of purpose at first address. I had been told that, and I had chosen not to do it. Saravin's expression did not change. You come alone. I do. No guard, no fleet in orbit. No, your world sends one man with a bag. I shifted the bag slightly on my shoulder. Earth sends what the situation requires. One of the advisors beside the princess leaned toward her and said something in low Val Thierry that my translation earpiece caught clearly. He said, an insult. They are mocking the ceremony. His name was Advisor Dreveth. I had read his file. He had been advocating against any treaty with Earth. For 11 years, he would continue to do so. Throughout this visit, and I had already planned for everything he would say. Saravin raised one hand slightly, and Dreveth went quiet. The presentation of achievements will begin, she said. Each representative will demonstrate the highest capability of their species. I had known this would happen. It was in the diplomatic briefing, and I had read every version of it going back 40 years. The other ambassadors went first. There were 6 of them representing the 6 other species currently in negotiation. With the Volthar sovereignty, the American ambassador activated a holographic display showing their species engineering capabilities. A star-sized energy relay they had constructed at the edge of their system. The Duvari representative demonstrated biological sample of their adaptive healing tissue. The Solon ambassador played a 3-minute acoustic composition on an instrument I had never seen before, and the sound of it was genuinely beautiful, a kind of layered resonance that seemed to vibrate in the walls themselves. I watched each presentation. I watched the court's reactions more carefully than the presentations themselves. Who leaned forward, who crossed their arms, which advisors whispered to each other and which watched in silence. I noted it all. Then it was my turn. I reached into my jacket and took out the notebook. It was a plain thing, dark blue cover, worn at the corners, the kind you could buy at any stationery shop on Earth for a few credits. I held it up so the court could see it. Nothing else. The reaction started as a murmur. It grew quickly, even with the earpiece filtering for relevant speech. I caught fragments. Is that all? And what is that object? And from somewhere near the back, a sound that I recognized as Volthar laughter. I did not react to the laughter. I stood with the notebook held out, perfectly calm, and waited for the noise to settle. Sarveth was not laughing. She was watching me with those still amber eyes, and I could see she was working through something. She had not expected this. She had expected me to be embarrassing, perhaps the underprepared representative of an unremarkable species, but she had expected something more obvious. A screen, a weapon, a demonstration, not a notebook held with the quiet confidence of someone who believed it was the most important object in the room. That is your achievement? She asked. It's a record, I said, of everything I've observed since I stepped off this shuttle. Your station's layout, your guard rotation patterns, your atmospheric systems, the names and ranks of everyone in this room, notes on the 11 conversations I've already overheard. I lowered the notebook and slipped it back into my pocket. I've been here for 4 minutes. The laughter had stopped. Seraphin looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "You will be assigned quarters on the lower residential level. The diplomatic proceedings begin tomorrow at first light cycle." The lower residential level was where they put visiting traders and low-priority technical delegations. It was 3 floors below where every other ambassador had been housed. The message was clear. I accepted the assignment with a nod and a small smile, and I followed the junior aide who had been sent to guide me there. My quarters were small, 1 room, functional furniture, a narrow window that looked out onto the station's interior maintenance corridor, rather than the star view that the upper floors enjoyed. The bed was designed for a species taller than me, so my feet did not reach the end. The climate controls were calibrated for Vol-30 body temperature, which ran warmer than human, and the room was uncomfortably hot. I set my bag down, took off my jacket, and opened the notebook to a fresh page. I spent the next 3 hours writing. By the time I was done, I had mapped the structural layout of the entire residential wing from what I had seen. During the walk from the docking bay, I had noted the locations of 5 emergency access panels, 2 maintenance shafts, and 1 junction box that controlled power distribution to the diplomatic floor above. I had recorded the shift change time for the guards stationed at the main corridor junction, which I had deduced from the brief overlap I'd witnessed between 2 sets of guards while being escorted. I had written down the names of every court member I had been introduced to, with a note beside each entry about what their body language had told me. I had noted that Advisor Dreveth's rank insignia was newer than the garment it was sewn onto, which meant he had been recently promoted and was likely still consolidating his position. That made him both more aggressive and more insecure. Useful. I had noted that one of the younger nobles, a tall man with silver-streaked hair named Farvin, had watched the Salon ambassador's musical performance with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine admiration rather than diplomatic politeness. That meant he valued beauty and craft. Also useful, I had noted that Princess Saravan had not spoken to Dreveth after silencing him, which meant she did not fully trust him, which meant there was space between them that might be worked. I closed the notebook and lay back on the too long bed and stared at the ceiling. She had put me in the worst quarters on the floor, given me the lowest formal rank, and let her court laugh at my notebook. She had done everything she was supposed to do to a representative of an unproven species who had arrived without ceremony or apparent capability. It was exactly what I had wanted her to do. People who underestimate you stop watching you carefully. They stop asking where you've been and what you've seen. They assume the answer is nowhere interesting and nothing important. They talk more freely. Their guards relax. They show you things they would never show someone they were worried about. I had been doing this for 23 years on worlds far less hospitable than this one. I knew what being underestimated felt like, and more importantly, I knew how to use it. I looked up at the ceiling of my small too-hot room and thought about the treaty sitting in the back of my notebook, already written, waiting for the right moment. I closed my eyes. She looked at me the way you look at something you have not yet decided whether to step on or ignore. I smiled in the dark. I have been underestimated by things far older and far more dangerous than a princess. First trial was announced at the beginning of the morning light cycle, when the station's overhead panels shifted from their night setting deep blue to a cooler, sharper white. I was already awake. I had been awake for an hour, sitting at the edge of my bed, rereading the previous day's notes and updating them with anything I had processed overnight. An aide arrived at my door and delivered the announcement in formal Veil theory, which my earpiece translated cleanly. All diplomatic representatives were expected in the Grand Assessment Hall. Within 1 hour, the trials would determine the formal standing of each species delegation within the sovereignty's diplomatic hierarchy. The Higher your standing, the more favorable your position at the treaty table. I put on my jacket, checked the notebook, and followed the aide. The grand assessment hall was on the upper level, 3 floors above my quarters. It was a wide circular space with tiered viewing galleries along the walls already filling with Veil Theory observers. When I arrived, the other 6 ambassadors were present, most of them accompanied by the aides and advisors they had brought with them. I was the only one who had come alone. Saravan was seated in an elevated chair at the far end of the hall, flanked by her senior advisors. Draveth was at her right hand. He saw me enter, said something to the person beside him, and then looked away. The trials had 3 components: combat, endurance, and strategy. The results of each would be scored, and the cumulative score would determine our standing. Most of the other ambassadors did not participate. Personally, the American ambassador was elderly and had brought a trained champion, a compact, powerful individual who moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent years doing nothing but preparing for exactly this kind of demonstration. The Duvari sent a representative who was half again my height. Even the Solon, whose culture I had understood to be relatively peaceful, had brought a skilled fighter. I stepped forward when my name was called. The Valthari official who was overseeing the trials looked down at his tablet, then up at me, then back at his tablet. "Ambassador Gray, your champion." "Ahmed," I said. He made a note without any visible reaction. He had probably seen stranger things. My opponent was a Valthari warrior named Karath, selected from the station's ceremonial guard. He stood 2 tall and was built like a structural support column. His reach was roughly twice mine. He was armed with a practice staff, and I was given one as well, a pole about 1.5 meters in length, blunted at both ends. The match began. He hit me in the first 4 seconds. I went down hard on the smooth stone floor, and I heard the sound of Valthari observers in the gallery reacting. Not quite laughter this time, something more uncertain. I had gone down too fast and too complete for it to be funny. There was something about watching a person take a serious impact and land the way had landed that tended to quiet rooms. I got up. Karath studied me. He was a professional. He had probably expected token engagement, something he could end quickly and cleanly, the sort of display that satisfied the ceremony without embarrassing anyone. Instead, I was standing back up with my staff raised, and I was looking at him differently. Now, the way you look at something after you understand how it moves. He hit me again, left side across the ribs. I went down again. I got up again. The third time I moved differently. I had watched how he planted his weight before each strike, the small shift in his left foot that preceded every swing. I could not match his speed or his power. That was not the point. I slipped the strike, not cleanly, but enough that it caught my shoulder instead of my chest, and I stayed on my feet. The tip of my staff connected with the back of his knee, not hard enough to do anything meaningful, but hard enough to make contact. He turned. His amber eyes had changed. He was paying attention now in a way he had not been before. We went for 6 more minutes. I went down 4 more times. Every time I got back up, every time I was on my feet, I had learned something new about how he moved, and I applied it. By the end, I had not won. I had not come close to winning, but I had made him work for it, and I had taken everything he offered and returned to standing. And there was something in the gallery that had shifted from uncertainty to something quieter and harder to name. When the match was called, Kareth stood for a moment looking at me. Then he placed the staff horizontally across his chest, which I recognized from my reading as a Valthari gesture used between warriors of acknowledged quality. I returned the gesture with my own staff, and he nodded once and walked away. I was breathing hard, my ribs ached, and my shoulder was going to be spectacular. Shades of color by tomorrow. I did not let either of these things show in my face. The second trial took place the following day, a simulated hostile environment, sealed chamber, 3 days of survival without outside support. Each ambassador was placed in a separate section. Mine was desert type, high heat, minimal water sources, low food availability. They gave me a small pack of basic supplies, enough for roughly 1 day. I spent the first hour doing a complete survey of the environment. It was a simulation, but it was a detailed one. The rock formations had natural properties. The sparse vegetation was real and had actual properties. The air temperature dropped measurably at certain hours, suggesting a cooling cycle in the simulation's climate controls, which meant the coldest air would collect in the lowest points of the terrain. I found water on the second morning by following the behavior of a small insect that did not seem like it belonged in a desert environment, which meant it had been placed there accidentally during the setup and was seeking moisture. It led me to a crack in a rock face where condensation had collected overnight. By the end of 3 days, I had a functional shelter built from loose stone and dried brush, mapped route to the 3 water sources. I had identified a rough calendar of the temperature cycles and a series of notes scratched into flat stones about where the best resources could be found. I left the notes arranged visibly at the shelter entrance. When the chamber opened and the Thavrian observers came in to assess the result, one of them found the notes. She read them, looked around at the shelter, at the mapped water sources, at the careful arrangement of resources. She called to a colleague who came and read the notes as well. Then they took photographs. The third trial was a strategy game called The Pattern of Stars, played on a complex board, representing a multi-system theater of conflict. The objective was to control the most territory at the end of 40 moves. I was paired with Farvin, the young noble I had noted on the first day, the one who had watched the music performance with genuine attention. He was a skilled player, better than me. Honestly, he had clearly studied the game deeply and played with real elegance. I lost. It was not particularly close, but on move 27, I made a sequence of moves that made no logical sense in terms of winning the game. I sacrificed my 2 strongest positions simultaneously, which opened my territory to immediate capture. Farvin took the positions as anyone would have. The match was as effectively over, but those 2 captured positions, combined with 3 others that Farvin had taken earlier in the game, created a configuration that I had seen before in Valthari military records, not the game manual, the actual historical military records of a border engagement 40 years ago, in which their fleet had been badly outmaneuvered by a species with far fewer ships. The configuration Farvin now held looked exactly like the Valthari fleet positioned at the start of that engagement. I pointed this out. The hall was very quiet. Farvin looked at the board, then he looked at me. He understood immediately what I was showing him, that the game was modeling a real vulnerability in Valthari's strategic doctrine, one that a sufficiently patient opponent could create deliberately, that I had not been trying to win the match. I had been trying to show them something that their own strategists had not noticed. He looked at the board for a long moment, then he looked at me and said, in careful English without the translator, "How long have you known this?" "Since I read the records of the Veth corridor engagement," I said, "about 3 years ago." He stared at me, then he said something in Valthari. My earpiece translated it as, "He came here to help us." That evening Saravin found me in the station's observation corridor, long glass-walled passage that looked out onto open space. I was standing at the window, watching the slow rotation of a distant gas giant, and I heard her approach but did not turn until she spoke. "You lost the combat trial," she said. "Yes, you lost the strategy trial. Also, yes, you nearly won the endurance trial. The observers gave you the highest score. The water was the key," I said. "Everything else follows from water." She was quiet for a moment, standing beside me at the window. This close, I could see details that the formal distance of the court did not allow. A small scar along her left jaw, years old from something that had not been a ceremony. Her hands, when they were not held in the formal court posture, were slightly restless, the fingers of her right hand moving in a slow, unconscious pattern against her robe. "You are not what you presented yourself to be," she said. Finally, I turned to look at her. Then, "I'm exactly what I presented, one man with a notebook." She looked back at the window. The gas giant turned slowly in the dark beyond the glass. "What I cannot understand," she said, "is whether you are very confident or very foolish." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "My grandmother used to tell me that the most useful thing a person can be is exactly as capable as they need to be, and no more visible than they have to be." Saravin turned and looked at me directly, those amber eyes steady and unreadable. "Your grandmother," she said carefully, "sounds like someone I would have found very dangerous." I smiled. "She was the most dangerous person I have ever known," I said, "and she never raised her voice once in her life." Saravin studied me for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. I turned back to the window. The gas giant continued to turn. I reached into my jacket and wrote 3 words in the notebook under Saravin's name in a column I had titled Revised Assessment. The 3 words were, "She is listening." That was enough for now. That was more than enough. I had been playing the fool since the moment I stepped off the shuttle, but there is a difference between a fool and a man who knows precisely how foolish he can afford to appear, and I had been walking that line for more than 2 decades. It gets easier over time, or maybe you simply get more comfortable with the weight of it. The gas giant turned. The stars held still. I put away the notebook and stood at the window until the light cycle shifted and the corridor grew quiet around me. I was exactly where I needed to be. The explosion did not announce itself. One Moment the station was routine, the corridors running with the steady, ambient sound of ventilation and distant machinery, the soft footsteps of guards doing their rounds, the low hum of the bioluminescent panels, then the floor lurched beneath me. I was in the secondary observation corridor on the residential level when it happened. The first impact came from somewhere below, a deep concussive pressure that I felt more than heard, like something enormous having its breath knocked out of it. The lights flickered, the ambient hum changed pitch. The second explosion came 6 seconds later, and it was closer. The wall to my left cracked, not dramatically, not like a scene in a story, but a fine branching crack that split upward from the floor junction and spread towards the ceiling while dust fell from the seams. The bioluminescent panels overhead went dark and were replaced a moment later by emergency lighting, dim red orange strips along the base of the walls. I was already moving. The notebook was out before I had consciously decided to take it out. Muscle memory. My hands found the page I had been updating every single day since I arrived, the structural map of the station's residential and diplomatic levels drawn from observation and cross-referenced against what I had found in the publicly available emergency procedure documentation that every visiting delegation was supposed to receive, but nobody ever read. I had read it 3 times, and I had compared it to what I had actually seen, because documents like that are always out of date. I ran to the main corridor junction. The guard post there was empty, which meant one of 2 things. The guards had responded to the emergency and moved to their designated stations, or they had moved toward the blast. Given the timing, probably both. I turned left toward the diplomatic level stairwell and then stopped. Voices coming from the cross corridor ahead of me, multiple speakers, elevated volume, one of them clearly in distress. I moved toward the sound instead of away from it, which is probably something a sensible person would not have done. But sensible had never been quite the right word for me. I came around the corner and found 4 people. Esraven was there, still in her formal court robes. Beside her was the noble Farvin, who had a cut across his forehead that was bleeding steadily. Behind them was a senior court aide, whose name I had recorded as Veleth, an older woman with close-cropped silver hair, and on the floor, leaning against the wall with his leg bent at an angle that was clearly wrong, was one of the personal guards, a young man I had seen at the entrance to the princess's chambers every morning. His face had gone the pale gray of Velthari. Under severe pain, Esraven saw me. Her expression shifted through several things very quickly and settled on something I had not seen from her before. Relief. She covered it immediately, but I saw it. The blast took out the main stairwell junction. She said, "The corridor behind us is blocked. The emergency communication system is not responding on this level." How long ago did the secondary explosion happen? I asked. Approximately 40 seconds before you arrived. I looked at the notebook page. Cross Corridor 7, residential level 3, power conduit junction for the upper diplomatic floor, ran through the wall 6M to the east of where we were standing. If the blasts had hit the primary power distribution points, as the changed hum in the ventilation suggested they had, then these emergency bypass routing would have pushed load through the secondary conduits, which ran along the interior wall of maintenance shaft 4. Maintenance shaft 4 had an access panel in the storeroom at the end of this corridor. There's a maintenance shaft 11M that way, I said, pointing. Access panel. Behind the shelving unit, it runs up 2 levels and exits near the secondary communication hub, which will be on its own isolated power circuit. Farvin stared at me. How do you know this? I read the emergency documentation, I said, and I checked it against what I could actually see. I moved toward the storeroom. Can your guard walk? Sarvin looked at her falling guard. Not on that leg. Then we carry him. There was a brief silence during which I could tell that nobody in that corridor had ever been told by a human ambassador that they were going to carry anyone. I did not wait for the silence to resolve itself. I went to the guard, who looked up at me with a pained and somewhat bewildered expression, and I got my arm under his and took his weight. He was large. All Vale Theory were large by human measure. He had perhaps 30 kg on me, maybe more. I adjusted my grip and straightened up and kept moving, because the alternative was to stand still and think about how heavy he was. And I did not have time for that. I heard footsteps behind me. Sarvin, Velith and Farvin followed. Storeroom was at the end of the corridor, a narrow space lined with shelving that held what appeared to be maintenance supplies, spare panel components, cleaning equipment, coiled cable. I set the guard down against the far wall as gently as I could manage, and he made a low sound that I recognized as a sound people make when they are in significant pain but are trying not to show it. Good man, I said quietly. He probably did not understand English, but tone carries. The shelving unit in front of the access panel was fixed to the wall on one side and freestanding on the other. I pushed the freestanding side. It pivoted, though. Panel behind it was marked in Vale Theory script and my reading level. Vale Theory was functional rather than fluent, but I had specifically memorized the vocabulary on emergency access panels. I had the panel open in 40 seconds. The maintenance shaft was narrow, very narrow by Vale Theory standards. For me, it was a reasonable fit. I looked back at Sarvin. I'll go first and confirm the route, I said. Farvin, can you support your guard if the two of you go together? Farvin nodded, pressing the fabric of his sleeve against the cut on his forehead. Valeth, stay with them until I send back a signal. When you hear me knock 3 times on the shaft wall, start moving. Valeth looked at Sarvin. Sarvin looked at me. You have been in this storeroom before, Sarvin said. It was not quite a question. First day, I said. I walked every accessible corridor on this level. Why? I looked at her. Because I'm the only person from my world on the station, I said. Simply. And I like to know where the exits are. I went into the shaft before she could answer. The shaft was dark and warm. The walls close on both sides, the metal floor under my hands emitting the faint vibration of the station's working systems. I moved upward by feel and by the rough map I had made in my head from the documentation. 1 junction at 3M. Turn right, continue climbing. The second level crossing should be at roughly 8M total. The ventilation sound was different inside the shaft, lower, more resonant, and I could hear somewhere below and to the east what sounded like a distant structural groan. Not immediate, but not nothing. I moved faster. At the 8M mark I found the secondary level exit panel, exactly Where it should have been, I pushed it. It opened into a short service corridor, lit by the same emergency strip lighting as the level below, but with one critical difference. At the far end of this corridor, the small green indicator light on the secondary communication hub was on. Isolated circuit exactly as planned. I went back to the shaft access, leaned in, and knocked 3 times on the wall. The wait was approximately 90 seconds. Then I heard movement below, the careful sounds of a group navigating a narrow space with an injured person. Farvin came up first, having clearly decided that he was going first regardless of what I had said, which I respected. Then Velith, moving with the efficient calm of someone who had lived through difficult things before. Then Saravin robes, gathered up in both hands, her expression focused and completely without the formal composure of the court chamber. Last came the guard, lowered by Farvin and lifted by me from the shaft exit, an exercise in uncomfortable geometry that took most of my remaining patience with my own body's limitations. He ended up on the service corridor floor, his back against the wall, breathing in the deliberate way of someone managing significant pain. I looked at my arm. During the lift, something had shifted in my right forearm. I had felt it happen, a sharp, specific sensation that I recognized from a previous experience with a climbing fall in my early career. Not a clean break, a fracture, the kind that hurts with a specific quality of complaint every time you move the arm. I looked at the corridor walls. There was a length of service cable coiled on a bracket near the communication hub. I went to it, uncoiled about 60 cm, and looked at the walls for something flat and rigid. A strip of paneling near the junction box was slightly loose. I pulled it free. About 40 cm long, metal reinforced. I set the panel strip against my forearm, wrapped the service cable around it 3 times and pulled the end tight with my teeth. Then I rotated my arm slightly to test the tension. Usable. Not comfortable, but usable. When I turned back, all 4 of them were watching me. Saravin's expression was something I could not classify. It was not the court composure, and it was not the focused calm she had worn in the shaft. It was something more direct and more unguarded than anything I had seen from her before. You broke your arm, she said. Fractured it, I said. It will hold. You did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. I moved to the communication hub. Let's get this working. The hub interface was in Velthari, which I could manage at reading speed. I found the emergency broadcast channel and activated it. Response came within 8 seconds. Station emergency management, requesting status and location. I handed the interface to Saravin because that conversation needed to happen in Velthari and faster than my reading speed could support. She spoke quickly and precisely. I listened and understood about 70% of it, enough to know that the station's emergency response teams were already active, that the primary blast had been in the lower engineering section, and that the diplomatic level was being treated as a priority evacuation. A team would reach our location in approximately 12 minutes. Saravin ended the communication and turned to me. What are you? She asked, not the way she had said it in the observation corridor, analyzing and slightly combative. This was different. This was a person asking a question they actually wanted an answer to. I sat down on the floor of the service corridor with my back against the wall, my fractured arm resting on my knee, and I thought about how to answer that. Tired, I said. It was the honest answer. It was also not the whole answer, but in that moment, in that corridor with the distant structural groan still making itself known somewhere below us, and the emergency lighting casting everything in flat orange, it was the answer I had. Saravan looked at me for a moment, then she sat down on the floor as well, her formal robes pooling around her, and she said nothing, and I said nothing, and the station hummed around us, and the stars continued outside as they always do. 12 minutes later, the emergency team arrived. I let them work. I answered the questions they directed at me. I accepted the medical attention they offered. I kept my notebook in my jacket pocket, and while the medic was wrapping my arm in a proper support brace, I kept my left hand free and wrote 4 words on the open page. Words were, she sat with me. I looked at those words for a moment, then I closed the notebook and let the medic finish. She had been asking the wrong question all along. She kept asking what I was worth. She should have been asking what I was for. I had been back in my quarters for 4 hours was when the messenger arrived. The door signal chimed at just past the 3rd light cycle. I was sitting at the small desk with my notebook open, working through a revised timeline of everything that had happened since the explosion. My arm was properly braced now. The station medics had been thorough, but it still registered its presence whenever I shifted position. I had learned to work around it. I opened the door. The messenger was a young aide I had seen once or twice in the hallways. Formal posture, the look of someone delivering something they had been told was important without being told why. The princess requests your presence, the aide said immediately. I closed the notebook, put on my jacket carefully around the brace, and followed. The princess's private meeting room was on the upper diplomatic level, a space I had not been inside before. It was smaller than the formal court chambers and deliberately plain by Vale Fairy standards, the furnishings functional rather than ceremonial. A long table, chairs that were too tall for me but which I sat in without adjusting, wide panels on the walls displaying in slow rotation of exterior star maps. Saravan was standing when I arrived. That told me something. She had been pacing and had stopped when she heard me come in. 2 people I did not recognize were seated at the table. Both had the bearing of intelligence officers, not the decorative kind that embassies use for show, but the working kind, the ones with careful eyes and still hands. On the table between them was a display screen, currently dark. Sit, Saravan said. She remained standing. I sat. She looked at the 2 officers. One of them reached forward and activated the screen. What appeared on it was a file header. The classification marking at the top of it was in the highest tier of Valthyre's secure documentation. Beneath the header was a photograph. The photograph was of me, but not a recent one. It had been taken approximately 16 years ago based on how I looked in it, and it had been taken outdoors on a planet I recognized immediately as Kath Maral, the border world where the Karathi negotiations had taken place. I was standing in a doorway in the middle distance, and whoever had taken this photograph had not intended for me to know they were doing so. Below the photograph was text, my name, my actual Name Callum Gray, which was in fact my real name, not a cover. Below that, a long series of entries. Saravin watched me look at the screen. We did not run your full background when you arrived, she said. Drevath considered it unnecessary. A single human with no apparent capability, no military presence. He advised that the standard diplomatic verification was sufficient. Her voice was flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it. We ran it last night after the emergency. What came back required the highest clearance in my authority to access. I said nothing. That file, she said, connects your name to the resolution of the Karathi border war, not the formal treaty, the actual ending of it, the sequence of unsigned letters sent to all three parties over a period of 7 months, each one knowing exactly what each party feared and exactly what they needed to believe about the other two parties in order to stop. The Karathi have been trying to identify who sent those letters for 9 years. They are in that file. She paused. Your name is in that file. I looked at the screen. Neutral Corridor Accords, she continued. Our intelligence section spent 3 years trying to identify who had architected those agreements. The accords prevented what our own modeling indicated would become a six-system conflict that would eventually have reached our borders. We issued a formal internal commendation for an unknown architect. That file says it was you. The second officer reached forward and scrolled the screen. Another entry appeared. The Selvith communication crisis, the Duvarian succession incident, the Marika internal accord. She named each one as it appeared on the screen. Each one was something I remembered, and each one had taken months or years out of my life. Every one of these events, at a moment of maximum instability, was resolved through what appears to be the work of a single individual operating without official title, without a visible presence, without any formal diplomatic standing. She looked at me directly. Earth knows who you are. What are you actually doing here? I considered the question carefully. The same thing I was sent to do, I said. Negotiate a treaty. You are not a diplomat. I'm whatever Earth needs me to be at a given time, I said. Right now they need a diplomat. Saravin sat down. At last, she sat across from me, and the two intelligence officers became very still in the way that intelligence officers do when they are watching a conversation and trying to record every detail. You are listed in Earth's official registry as retired, she said. I am retired, I said. This is a personal favor to the Foreign Office. I am technically a civilian contractor on this assignment. One of the intelligence officers made a sound that might have been disbelief. I did not look at him. Why did Earth send you specifically? Saravin asked. Because I know your people, I said. I have been studying the Vale Ferry sovereignty for 20 years, your history, your political structures, your decision-making patterns, your internal factional dynamics. I know what your sovereignty needs, and I know what it is afraid of, and I know how to write a treaty that gives you what you need in terms that do not require you to admit to the fear. Saravin was very quiet, and I said, because I look like nothing, because when people think you're nothing, they show you everything. She looked at me. Across the table, you walked onto this station deliberately presenting yourself as unimportant. I walked onto this station presenting myself as exactly what I am, one person with a notebook. I simply allowed everyone to draw their own conclusions about what that was worth. The lower quarters, she said. Laughing court, the combat trial, you let all of that happen. I chose all of that, I said. The lower quarters meant 3 days of unsupervised access to a section of the station that nobody thought worth watching. The combat trial, getting back up every time, that wasn't a performance, that was just what you do. But it told me things about how your people assess character that I needed to know from observation rather than reading. Saravin was quiet for a long moment. The star maps on the walls rotated slowly through their cycle, the strategy game. She said finally, you did that to show Farvin the fleet vulnerability. I needed someone in your court to understand that. I came here as something other than a threat or curiosity, I said. Farvin was the right person, he thinks carefully, and he does not have a fixed position on Earth treaty question the way Dreveth does. You have been managing this court from the moment you arrived. I have been talking to this court, I said. Managing implies I had more control than I did. I planned for the scenarios I could anticipate and improvised the rest. The explosion was not part of any plan. No, she said, but you knew where the maintenance shaft was. That was just reading the documentation. She looked at me for a very long time, then she said quietly, you carried Aaron through that corridor. My guard, he weighs considerably more than you. He needed to be carried. That is not an answer. It's the only answer there is, I said. Someone needed help. I was there. Everything else is details. Seraphin stood and walked to the wall panel, looking out at the slow turning star map. Her back was to me, which was either a sign of trust or a deliberate choice to not let me read her face. Given what I knew of her, probably the latter. The sabotage, she said, it was internal. Dreveth's faction, Earth, represented a diminishment of vile Tharis standing in the region. They intended to destroy the diplomatic wing, to end the negotiations before they could conclude. She paused. They did not intend for me to be on that level when the devices activated. The timing went wrong on their end. I know, I said. She turned. You know, I suspected it from the second day, I said. Dreveth's behavior was consistent with someone who had a contingency plan that did not depend on the negotiations. He was not arguing against the treaty because he thought he could win the argument. He was creating a public record of opposition so that when the talks collapsed, he would have documented evidence of his position. I reached into my jacket, one-handed, and took out the notebook. I have been watching him for 6 days. The pattern was clear by day 2. I set the notebook on the table, not the current one. I opened it to the back section where I kept a separate set of observations organized by subject rather than chronology. Under Dreveth's name there were 2.5 pages of notes. Saravin came back to the table and looked at the notes. She did not touch the notebook, just looked. Her expression as she read moved through something I was not accustomed to seeing from her. Not the court composure, not the focused calm. Something closer to the way a person looks when they realize they have been inside a room with something they did not understand, and they are working out exactly how long that has been happening. You wrote this before the explosion, she said, reading the dates. Most of it, yes. You knew there was a threat to the station, and you did not report it. I didn't have confirmation, I said I had a pattern that suggested a contingency plan of unknown type. I was still gathering information. If I had raised a formal alarm on the basis of notebook observations, Dreveth would have known I was watching him, and I would have lost the rest of what I needed. She looked at me. People could have been harmed. Yes, I said. That is the part of this work that I have never found a way to make easier, the calculation between acting too early and losing the full picture, or waiting longer and accepting risk. I got the timing wrong. I should have moved 2 days earlier. I looked at my braced arm. That calculation is on me. Saravan was quiet. Do you have enough now? She asked. Finally, whatever it is you were gathering, yes. I said, then show me. I opened the notebook to the very last pages. They were different from the rest of the notebook, not observations, not maps or names or behavioral notes. These pages were covered in clean, careful text, organized in numbered clauses, the way formal documents are organized. I had written it in English, but I had also written a Velthari translation beside each clause, working from the language study I had been doing for 2 years before this mission. I turned the notebook and slid it across the table. I wrote this before I boarded the shuttle. I said, it is the treaty that I believe Earth and the Veltharis sovereignty should sign, every clause in it has been written to account for what your sovereignty needs, including the things your court has not yet said aloud in any negotiation session. I have accounted for your border security concerns, your economic priorities in the neutral corridor, your internal factional dynamics around sovereignty identity, and the specific language your court would require in order to ratify any agreement without it appearing to be a concession. Saravan looked at the notebook. She reached forward very slowly and turned the page. She read, the intelligence officers were very still. She read for a long time, 3 pages. For her expression shifted as she read, and I watched it shift, the small tightening around her eyes when she reached a clause she had not expected, the brief widening when she found something that clearly addressed a concern she had thought was not publicly known. Finally, she looked up. You wrote this before you met us, she said. I told you. I said 20 years of study. I wanted to make sure the first thing I gave you was something worth keeping. She looked at me across the table, and this time her face was something I had not seen before on it, not relief, not suspicion, not the calculating assessment of the court. It was the way a person looks when they realize they have been standing in front of something remarkable, ought, and only just understood what they were looking at. The 2 intelligence officers sat very still and said absolutely nothing. I folded my hands on the table, my braced arm alongside the other, and waited. The morning after, I stood in the station's small medical observation room while a Velthari doctor checked the progress of the fracture with a scanning device that emitted a faint harmonic tone. My arm was progressing normally, she said, in Velthari, then English, then Velthari again, as she apparently forgot which language she had begun in. I thanked her. In both, the station felt different that morning. The Velthari stations were not the kind of place that changed their atmosphere in obvious ways. No whisper networks or visible mood shifts in the corridors, but I had been watching people long enough to read the smaller signals. The guards at corridor Junction stood with slightly less of the formal rigidity they had maintained for the first days of my visit. 2. Court aides who passed me in the hallway made eye contact in a way they had not before. News of the explosion and the rescue had traveled. News of Drevath's arrest had traveled faster. Saravan had moved on Drevath's faction within hours of our meeting, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the precise and thorough efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly enough evidence and had now received it. By the time I ate my morning meal, 4 members of the faction were in custody and the rest were under surveillance. Saravan had managed it without public announcement, without drama, without giving any of them time to coordinate a response. I had not needed to suggest it. I had mentioned in our meeting that public disclosure and formal process tended to produce more durable political outcomes than quiet removal. She had listened, and she had done it her way, and her way was probably better suited to Valthari political reality than mine would have been. That was as it should be. I was here to offer perspective, not to run their government. The question of the treaty was moving. Now, after the meeting in the intelligence room, Saravan had taken the notebook and kept it overnight. She had returned it the following morning with a folded sheet of Valthari paper tucked inside, covered in her own handwriting. Notes, questions, suggested amendments. 3 clauses she wanted to discuss directly. It was more than a beginning. It was the shape of a genuine conversation. Farvan had sent me formal message requesting a meeting to discuss the strategic vulnerability I had identified in the game, not the diplomatic kind of meeting, not a formal proceeding. He had written in imperfect but earnest English that he wanted to understand it properly and that he believed Sevelsob's offer and his senior strategists needed to understand it as well. Velith, the senior court aide who had been with us in the corridor, had stopped me that morning outside the medical room and said simply that she was glad we had all come through. She said it in Velthari and waited patiently while my earpiece processed it. I thanked her and meant it because she was the kind of person who says what they mean, and those people are rarer than they should be. The treaty was scheduled for the 4th day after the explosion. Saravan had chosen to move quickly, and I agreed with the reasoning. A delayed signature gives opposition time to regroup. The Drevath faction was temporarily neutralized, but political factions do not stay neutralized. The window was open, and the right move was to step through it. The signing ceremony was held in the Grand Court chamber. The full diplomatic corps of the sovereignty was present. The other ambassadors were there as well, arranged in the viewing gallery, and I could see from their expressions that they were trying to understand what had happened and how, 3 days ago, had been the lowest ranked delegate on the station. Now I was standing at the primary table. Saravan stood across from me. She was in formal court dress, indigo robes and rank insignia, every element of the ceremony correct. The document on the table between us was a formal rendering of the treaty, translated into both English and Velthari, bound in materials I could not identify, but which clearly signified importance by the reaction of the assembled court when it was brought in. The ceremony called for formal statements. Saravan gave hers in Velthari, clear and measured, the language of a leader making a decision she had thought Through carefully, the court translator gave the English version, and it was good, accurate, and dignified. When it was my turn, I did not have a prepared statement. I had not written one which Velif had looked somewhat pained about when she found out that morning. I stood at the table and I said, "The Veil Theory sovereignty has been a remarkable host. I have learned more in the past 10 days than I expected to in 10 years. I am glad to be here, and I am glad to put my name to this document, and I hope that when we are old and our children or our successors are the ones running these things, they look back at this paper and think that we did not waste the opportunity. It was not elegant, it was not diplomatic language, it was just true." Saravan looked at me while I said it. When I finished, she held my gaze for a moment longer than the ceremony required. Then she turned to the document. The signing pen was a ceremonial instrument, formal and precisely made. I had brought the pen I always carried, the one I used in the notebook. It was not ceremonial, it was a plain thing, worn smooth at the grip from years of use, the clip slightly bent from an incident involving a very small and very determined space station access panel. I signed with it, then I held it out to Saravan. She looked at it, then she looked at me, then she took it and signed her name beside mine. The court was very quiet for a moment. Then the sound began, a deep harmonic that I recognized as the Veil Theory form of formal acknowledgement, not applause exactly, but something that carried the same intention. I took the pen back and put it in my jacket pocket. The formal proceedings after the signing lasted 3 hours. I participated in each stage with full attention, 'cause formality matters. And I have never believed in cutting corners on the things that matter to the people you are working with. I ate the ceremonial meal, said the correct things in the correct sequence, shook hands, and exchanged the appropriate formal gestures with every official I was required to meet. By the time it was done, I was tired in the way that comes not from physical effort but from sustained attention over a long period. The particular tiredness of a person who has been watching everything and keeping it all organized. That evening I found my way to the observation corridor. Again, the long glass-walled passage where I had first spoken with Saravan. After the strategy trial, the station had returned to its normal light cycle. The panels overhead glowed in the cold blue of evening setting. The gas giant was gone from this view angle now, replaced by a field of distant stars that I did not recognize from Earth visible positions. That always took a moment to adjust to. Different sky, different stars, and the ones you grew up with nowhere to be found. I heard her before I saw her. The specific sound of Valthuri, formal footwear on the corridor floor, which was different from the softer soul of everyday wear. Saravan came to stand beside me at the window. We were quiet for a moment. The stars held their positions in the dark. Beyond the glass, your people are strange, she said finally. Yes, I agreed. You send one person with a notebook. It was the right number for the situation. You get knocked down and stand up again without explanation. It is a human habit, I said. We find it difficult to stay down. She was quiet again for a moment. Then my intelligence office tells me that your arm will need 6 weeks to fully heal. About that, you set it yourself against a wall in a maintenance corridor. It seemed like the sensible thing. My intelligence office also tells me. She said that you have completed 11 previous operations of this type in 11 different systems, and that in all 11 you never once took credit for any of it. She paused, that you specifically requested that your name not appear in any public documentation. Recognition is not the point, I said. The outcome is the point. The outcome, she said, in several of those cases was that wars did not happen, millions of lives were not disrupted, and nobody knows. Some people know, I said. The right people. Does it not bother you that your world sent you here specifically because you look like nothing? I thought about that. Honestly, it was a good question. I had asked it of myself over the years in different forms. My grandmother used to say that a river does not need to make noise to move mountains, I said. Noise is the river telling you it is small and afraid. A deep river is quiet. Saravin turned from the window and looked at me directly. Your grandmother. Again, she had quote for everything. She sounds, Saravin said, like someone who understood what you understand. She taught me most of it, I said. Saravin turned back to the window. She was quiet for a long time, and I let the quiet be what it was. I would have had you removed from this station, she said, in the first week if the talks had not progressed. I want you to know that. I know, I said. You told me. What I did not tell you is that I had already decided not to before the explosion, before the intelligence file, before any of it. She looked at the stars, after the observation corridor, after the strategy trial, something about the way you spoke to me, as if you already knew everything I was going to say before I said it, and you were simply waiting to confirm it. She paused. It was unsettling. I am sorry, I said. That is not always a comfortable thing to be around. No, she agreed, but it is a useful thing. She turned to look at me, and her expression was the kind that a person only wears when they have decided to be honest about something. You are leaving tomorrow, first shuttle, and you will go to the next system. And GT, the next situation. And GT, that is the plan. She was quiet. Stars were very still beyond the glass. I will file a formal diplomatic report, she said, stating that Ambassador Callum Gray of Earth conducted himself with exceptional skill throughout the proceedings, that his handling of the emergency was of material benefit to the station and its personnel, that the treaty represents a significant achievement for both parties. She paused. These things are true, and they will be stated formally. Thank you, I said. She reached into the sleeve of her robe and produced something small. She held it out to me. It was a flat disc of dark material, smaller than my palm, etched with a single Velthari glyph. This is not a diplomatic gesture, she said. This is personal. In the sovereignty, this is given to someone whose true quality was not immediately apparent, whose surface did not match their depth. She looked at me steadily. We have a word for this. It means the same thing as saying that a thing was worth more attention than it received, that to overlook it was a failure of perception. I took the disc. I looked at the glyph. I had been studying Velthari glyphs for 2 years, and I recognized this one. I'd seen it in historical texts, used very rarely in reference to individuals of particular consequence. I will keep this, I said. Good, she said. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor. I stood at the window. For a while after she left, the disc sat in my palm, warm from being carried in her sleeve. I turned it over once, looked at the glyph, and then put it in my jacket pocket beside the pen. The shuttle would be ready at the first light cycle. I had already packed. The notebook was in my inside pocket, the old one full, a new one already waiting in my bag with the first page dated and the name of the next destination written at the top. I took out the new notebook, opened it to the first page. Below the destination name, I wrote one line. It was the glyph she had given me transliterated into English letters so I could read it aloud when I wanted to. It translated roughly as one who was worth fearing all along. I looked at that for a moment, then I turned to the second page, wrote today's date in the corner, and began